Hello and welcome to episode 164 of Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers
by writers
to keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Nick.
I'm Sameem.
I'm Shingai.
And I'm Will.
All right, we are back with a different setup, different people, and we're still in chapter 2 of The Secrets of Character by Matt Bird. And I'm stoked to continue this conversation and to see what folks who haven't joined this conversation yet about this book have to say. I'm pretty stoked. But before we get to that, Will has something he would like to say at the top of the show. Go ahead, buddy.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to thank our Patreons for supporting us. And if you would like to support us, please sign up on Patreon because it will cover our bills and we can do more. So Marshall's going to read off all of our patrons who are been a part of us. Go ahead, Marshall.
Yeah. And we do have bills. So it's really nice when people join us. And we have a few tiers on there. So definitely do it. And here's the list. We have Sarah Hipple, Katie Inser, Aaron Roberts, Kelly, Taylor Sauce. I'm going to butcher some names. Thea, Daniel Evanson, Michelle Stewart, Elaine Chen, Ben Leonard, Todd, Eric, Elan, Carrie Becker, Fishman, Barbara Lund, Mindy, and Gabe. So thanks again to everybody. I just realized Gabe was at the bottom of the list. I was like, well, he's still there. Well,
Gabe also hosts with us. That's how he got on the show, by bribing us.
I kind of love it, actually, that he's still there. So yeah, ready to get back into it?
Let's go.
All right. So last time we left off, we were getting into chapter 2. We left off talking about giving your characters a full life, and that was under this banner that Matt put forward that says the 4 aspects of believability, right? So we didn't get to the other 3. I don't think we're going to get to the last one of these 3, mostly because if you remember from last time, that personality section has a bunch of subcategories. So we'll see how the conversation goes. But the other 3 are a fully fleshed out life, universal behavior, and a specific personality. So like I said, personality's got a bunch of subcategories, which I think is worth talking about, at least in chunks. And I'm going to do that a little bit tonight with some of these subtopics that he's got under the first couple, because really I just want to kind of chunk them and ask you guys how you feel about them and about your writing and what you see this in. So that's kind of the structure of the episode this week. Let's see. I am going to read a couple of his examples. Honestly, I'd rather throw it to you guys since there's enough of us here and, you know, we're well read and we're writers and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a couple that I am definitely going to read, but or mention, and then I'll throw it at you guys. So that's basically how this is going to go. Ready?
Yeah.
Let's go.
Cool. All right. So I'm going to read the opening of this. I got to get it up here. Hold on a second. The section that we're going to start with is called A Fully Fleshed Out World. Okay. So he writes, when we're watching a movie or TV show, we always want the sense that there's something going on outside of the frame. If we suddenly turn around, would we see a soundstage, or would we find that this world is fully immersive? This is equally true of novels. We want the sense that there's a full world here, and our hero is just one part of it. So the next section is give us sensory information about their world. This is an area where different types of writers get jealous of others. Novelists and memoirists have access to all 5 senses, but it's harder to directly convey smell and taste in movies, TV, plays, and comics. Nevertheless, in every medium, you must fully engage your reader, and the best way is to fully engage as many senses as you can. He goes on to give a couple of examples. I'm actually going to skip past the examples in this section and highlight something else that he says a little bit later after the examples. He mentions smell because he's talking about how it is difficult to do those kind of things, obviously in a visual medium. But he says smell is the sense most linked to memory, which I actually kind of liked because I think that's an important thing to bring up when we talk about the senses. So my question to you all is, what is your mindset when it comes to sensory detail and that whole showing versus telling when it comes to fleshing out a world? Where have you seen this done so well? Our listeners should take note. So you can talk about your own writing. You can talk about where you've seen it done well, but I'm also curious on really what is your mindset or process when it comes to, or how you feel even about showing versus telling and sensory detail in your work and works that you read. And whoever wants to start can go. Would you like me to put some semblance of that in the chat?
Yes.
Because the teacher version of me just says it in a couple different ways. Okay, go ahead.
I'll start with the showing versus telling. I think we have to be careful of that dichotomy, because there are a lot of traditions where telling is okay and is a part of the culture. Mm-hmm. We've been based on Western culture of this show, don't tell. But I think it depends on where the author's coming from and the history of their background. That's number one. I would say sensory detail. I do this thing, and we've done this exercise, I think, together, Marshall, me, you, and Nick, where after I'm doing edits, I will actually get 5 different colored pencils, and I will go through sight, sound, hearing, touch, and then movement. And I got this from a class with Nello Hopkinson, and she told me to start doing that. And with smell, I think smell can be used not just for food. It can be used for like rivers or people or rooms. Because have you ever gone back home and then you smell that smell of home? Like your family's house. And then you go back to your apartment and you start to see that, I have like this own scent and how it reawakens. So I try to use smell a lot, actually, and taste. Some books that I think do smell really well is actually the new one, the one from P. Djeli Clark that we read.
The one we can't remember the title of exactly.
Yeah, the Dead Cattail Assassins. Yeah, that one is so good for it. And also Matt Wallace's Sin du Jour books, which is all about like an otherworldly restaurant catering for like monsters and everything. I think he does a really great job in that.
For sure. And I do have a follow-up actually to what you said in the beginning. Don't let me forget about telling. I have a modified version of that depending on how people responded. So, all right. Someone else?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I'm with Will on this one. I think in the very beginning, like if you were first starting out as a writer, I think the show versus tell rule is kind of imperative, because you want to get away from being too info dumpy and exposition and things like that. But I think there are some things that you can tell and you don't need to show because of the genre expectations. And I think that's what I would look at during that show versus tell type thing is, am I in a fantasy world? Do I have to explain what a dragon is? Or can I just say a dragon with X features or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. I don't have to go into too far details. I don't have to describe certain things and things like that. I can just say it's a dragon. But if I put a dragon, in a romance, well, what are we talking about here? So there's that type of sense that I would look at. Yes, I know there's different versions of the dragons and things like that. And if we want to go down a whole entire episode about that we can, but we're not. Mr. Know-it-all over here, Mr. Will.
Yes, there are lots of different dragons, but most people, when you say you have a dragon, they think of a dragon, right? They're not thinking of a cow,
Correct. And no one has to sit there and be like, oh, what is a dragon, right? There's some genre expectations there that you have to do. Now, what I like the sensory detail, though. That goes back to Matt Bell's book, Refuse to Be Done, as a layering process. So you write your skeleton book, basically, and then you go back through and do what Will said, right? What are the details? What are you doing for sensory and things like that? And where are you leaning too heavy on versus where you're not leaning enough into, and doing a draft just on sensory details and movement and things like that. And so that's kind of like what I look at with your question on that one, and what I'm looking at for my novel right now. As soon as I get some feedback from somebody,
so yours is more of a do a sensory detail pass at a draft rather
Mhm.
than take it intentionally when you write?
Yeah, so that, and that's the thing. When it comes to that type of stuff, right? I'm figuring out my writing process still. Like, I thought I knew what it was when I started my MFA, and then I got done and realized I have a completely different process that I've discovered. And so it's one of those things where I like the layering aspect of things because I love the drafting process. And every time I go and I try to add everything in I need to in that first draft, it doesn't come out right. It's so up and down on that. And so the process I'm trying to now is like, just get the words on the page, just build the story. And then I can go in and start layering that up and things like that. Again, this goes back to Refuse to Be Done by Matt Bell and what I've pulled away from that one.
And this is, and I don't know if this helps too for anybody that hasn't spoke yet, but you know, this is all through that lens of characterization too, right? It's like, you know, and there's so many factors involved with like POV, and that kind of thing, like, and who that character is. So I think having that in your mindset, I think is kind of what I'm getting at here is how do you approach that when you're inserting your character in a fully fleshed out world too, right? Yeah. So thoughts on that, Sameem or Shingai?
I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to think about is the two novels that stuck with me last year. Vagabonds by Elogosa Osunde and Things They Lost by Okwiri Adore. Okwiri is a Kenyan writer, Elogosa is a Nigerian writer. And there weren't stories that were very heavy on showing the world building. And I think this ties back to the thing that Will was talking about in the beginning, where like different cultural expectations allow you to create a world without necessarily showing all the way, and it would still be just as intriguing. And I think that the worlds that were built, the atmosphere that was created in these two books for me were atmospheres of like very rich world building, but it wasn't because it was necessarily shown. It was mostly told in gossip. Like Nigeria became a god. It took on a personality, you know? Like the city itself became like a living being, and the stories of it is how you found out the energy that it carried. Yeah, so there's something interesting there that I'm still trying to figure out how to say exactly. But that's something that I really enjoyed. I also really enjoy playing with the senses myself. I think my favorite way to play with the senses on the page is writing about the ocean, because I feel the ocean very deeply within me wherever I am. And I was just realizing that as I was trying to think up an answer. But I can like tell you what it tastes like, how it feels when I'm like underwater and I can't breathe, and the bubbles of like air and water playing with each other, just different really cool things about the ocean that I experience in my body. So I very much enjoy writing the senses in that space.
Well, it's funny, just you saying that for someone who lives less than a mile from the Pacific, like I hear you. Like anytime I go to the ocean, it's like, I mean, that's a really, no, I like that. And again, that comes, and there's some other things that we're going to get to about what we bring to the table and what our experiences are too, how we put that into our characters too. So no, I love that. Sameem, got any opinions on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I really love atmosphere, like Shinkai said. I think that like puts it really well for me, because I think both when I read and when I write, I don't consciously go through the senses. I don't think I go checklist it either. Maybe I should. But I don't think that much about, did I cover all the senses, and am I giving people a rich world to exist in? I don't like reading that way either. And I think if there's a long setup of scene without character, I'm skimming. like I'm not getting anything until it connects to the character. So if it's like setting this like lush environment, I don't read a lot of like epic fantasy, so maybe this explains why. But if it's like setting up this like lush environment, but there's no character in it yet, no characters that I care about, and I think Matt kind of touches on this a little bit too in the book, but I just like this is getting skimmed, not by choice. It's just my brain, and I think I'm that way with writing too. I think I add in sensory details, not consciously, but just based on what I want the characters to be going through, and what's important to them in the moment. So I think that's why I like the word atmosphere. Sits with me really well. I think there's a book I read 20 years ago, probably in high school, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And there's a scene, I might have talked about this before, but there's a scene where the main character goes to get, I think it's like baked yams from a street vendor, and keeps going back for more and for more and for more. And the sensory details in that, I remember a lot about the book, but it was so long ago, and that scene still is like really vivid in my memory. And I don't think it's just the sensory details. I think it's the way that it made the character feel, and why that was so critically important for that character, and what was revealing to the character himself in the moment.
Yeah. Will, did you want to say, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think it's not, for sensory detail, it's not something I think of consciously at first. It's always usually when there needs to be clarity for something, and when I'm editing. So like when I go through that marker phase and looking, sometimes I notice I'm relying too much on one of our senses, and I think that can feel repetitive. So I try to take that out and replace it. And I think a book that is really great at sensory details, and it's of course from Nalo because she's the one I learned from, is Midnight Robber. Midnight Robber is so good for sensory details through character, but also if you want to learn about dialect, if you really want to learn how to have characters speak, like write the way that those characters would speak, that's like an also excellent book.
Go ahead, Sameem.
Yeah, I did want to say, not to like question that process, because I think I do that, and I think I should do that more. But I also think it's like, if you keep coming back to the same sensory input over and over again, that might be really important for what you're trying to tell your reader, what you're trying to tell yourself in that scene. And so I'd be like, it's okay to like reflect on that and be like, is that really all I want to say? Or should I add more? Or like, do I really want to zero in on that? Yeah.
And I think I would add too, like, I appreciate what you said, Sameem, because I'm kind of the same way. I'm like, I don't go into it consciously, but I think, and this is why we were having a conversation last week. Like LP and Brent were great because they butt up against some of the ways that this was presented, right? But like, it makes me think like maybe I should, maybe, you know what I mean? Maybe I should go with a little more intention with sensory detail, because I think I have a hard time adding it in revision as well. And I think that's something I just realized. But what I'm teaching right now that does a killer job of sensory detail, mostly because the book is written in verse. I'm teaching Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds.
I love that book.
The sensory detail, like, especially in the beginning when people start visiting him in the elevator, there's these references to cigarettes, and it's done in verse, so it's like it's poetry, so every word on the page matters, but he nails the sensory detail. One of the characters touches the main character on the shoulder, and there's just one line about how her perfume is coming off of her wrist to his nose. I mean, the smell of the cigarette smoke, the feel of the cigarette smoke and stuff like that. You really feel, and this is a conversation I was having with my students today, is that if you've ever been in a room that's filled with smoke, he's captured that feeling. Even if you've never experienced it, if you have experienced it, you're right there with the character and knowing how he's feeling. And he does an amazing job at that. What were you going to say, Will?
Okay.
There you go.
I think on the intentionality of being repetitive, I think it comes down to also feedback, right? Like when you have, I always look at the feedback from multiple different people. And if they're all getting the sense that something's repetitive, then it's like, is that distraction? Or sometimes, what's to Sameem's point, sometimes you are intentionally trying to be repetitive. So it's like anything else, a balancing act. I think when it comes to repetition of senses, I think everyone should also read The Book of Lost Souls by Daniel Jose Older, because there's a couple chapters in there that really it is repetitive, but is very like pointed of why it's repetitive. And that's like a great example.
So I think I'm going to skip past that follow-up I was talking about with the telling, because I think we've kind of covered that a little bit. And that's not really what Matt Bird is talking about, is showing versus telling. He's really talking about sensory detail. I guess I'll throw it out there in case anybody wants to throw an idea on top of this one. But Nick kind of said this a little bit, but is telling is a must, right? Is telling a must when it comes to fleshing out a world? And I think this might be what Sameem butts up against too, with some of the atmospheric stuff in epic fantasy and things like that, right? What were you going to say, Will?
Well, like I think Shingai's example of a story being told through gossip is so amazing. Like it's such a fun way to tell, but it's also telling you a lot about the characters themselves without showing them, you know, because it's all done through gossip. And you can get so many inflections of a character's like whole vibe and presence through gossip. I mean, who doesn't love good tea? I do.
I taught a class called Gossip is Alternative History, and it was one of my favorite things to teach.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I would love to take that class. Okay, I'm gonna smash the next two together because I think you guys will have some good stuff with this one. And so the next two subcategories in this section are anthropomorphize nature and give them songs and dances. Okay, so again, to have that fully fleshed out world, he starts off I can never say this word right. Anthropomorphize nature. This one is pretty much just a trick for prose writers. One great way to make the world come alive is to actually make the world come alive. Treat nature like a person. He gives an example, but I'm going to put this up with give them songs and dances and read from that really quick too. Everyone is part of a culture of one kind or another, and the easiest way to make your hero's culture come alive is to convey their song lyrics, whether it's a song the hero's family has been singing for generations, or just one that the hero has made up. What are your thoughts? I see the first one as a kind of a tip. I mean, the example he gives is from, what was it? From a memoir called Educated. He talks about how this author anthropomorphizes nature and gives it, treats it like a person in order to bring it to life, right? So what are your thoughts on that, but also how do you incorporate things like song and dance and things like that and bring that culture to your characters? Go ahead, Will.
Okay, so I have great examples for like making a city or a borough, like here in New York, a character, which is N.K. Jemisin's The City We Became. Right? I think that's the title, but it's so good because each borough has like this energy and personality. And also Mur Lafferty did something similar in her early books, The Shambling Guide to New York and The Shambling Guide to New Orleans, where the setting actually is a character. And if you want to take it like with TV, you have Sex in the City, you know, New York City is a whole character, you know, and I think that's just a fun way to get your characters involved, you know, and to create like a bigger world. And it can be really easy. I think to Brent's point last episode, he was like, you don't have to know everything about the world. There's just these little things you can sprinkle in and let everyone else kind of imagine it. And I think that's what you can do when you allow the setting to have like a personality and the way the characters react in the setting.
Well, and I just have to throw this example because right when you said that, I'm like, oh, I have a great example for this. The Haunting of Hill House, that opening, the house being described as a living, breathing, like an entity, right? And how these characters exist in that house is all because of that, just such a vivid description of the fact that this house is not just a house. How is a house insane? I don't know, but it's brilliant the way it plays out. You know what I mean? Okay, I jumped in there because I had to say that. Any thoughts? Who's next? Go ahead, Shingai.
I feel like this also just speaks to indigenous perspectives of seeing the land as alive and living. Living in Vermont, for me, it's very easy to write about nature as being alive because it feels alive all the time, except for the long winter when it's dead for 4 months on end.
Brutal.
It's so brutal.
I couldn't deal with it.
The sun. I need the sun.
I hear that.
But yeah, like I love to describe trees as having feelings. I actually, in my novel, the one that I have a full draft of, there's a collective of baobab trees that are constantly discussing human affairs.
Oh, that is so fun. That is so awesome.
Yeah, and shit like that. It feels like it makes sense to me because there's also all these stories in my tribal knowledge and understanding of like Gikuyu mythology, where, you know, a person was saved by Mugumo tree, which is our tree of life. And like the relationship between people and animals was always fluid and interconnected, as well as the relationship between spirits and people. So yeah, it was just bringing up all these, like for indigenous perspectives, this is normal.
Yeah. Makes sense to me. Sameem or Nick, thoughts?
I don't know if I have anything too much more than that, other than
what about songs and dances? Like one of the examples, and sorry to cut you off, but I'm gonna say one of the examples he gives, of course, is one of the most famous ones, is Tolkien's work when it comes to having songs on the page, right? So just to throw us into that, just as another option, like, you know, how intentional are we with things like music in our work or dance? Like, I just think it's he's suggesting this because obviously this is a way to show a character's culture, right? But, you know, what actually, I'm just going to read this because it's funny. He says it's somewhat counterintuitive, but book readers actually love song lyrics, even though we don't necessarily know the tune, right? So like when you see songs or lyrics on the page, I don't know how you guys react to it, or if it's time to skim, or I don't know, like, and how you incorporate that into your writing. So if that helps to me.
I don't incorporate it. I skim it when I read it.
Yeah, I think it depends on the what and why. I read a lot of Roald Dahl with my daughter a couple of years ago, and he does this all the time in his books, and sometimes it worked and it sort of like told you things about the plot that you weren't getting elsewhere, and sometimes it's like, yeah, this is fun and silly, but it felt like a burden to read.
Yeah.
That's a very good way to put that.
Yeah, and so it's like, this is totally possible that this is my lack of skill and imagination, or just being like exhausted trying to put a kid to sleep. I'm not sure which one it is. But I think I can't think of examples off the top of my head, but I think there's other times where it's like, oh, that works really well. I think you want to make sure it's not like forced. Like I would be really reluctant to add it in as a checkbox of like, here, now I've shown you this aspect of the culture. Whereas if it's the environment, if it's the setting as a character, I think that's different.
All right. Nick, and then we'll go back to Will. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah. So I'm gonna bring up probably something Gabe would bring up is Pat Rothfuss' Name of the Wind. Yeah, Will's throwing up his hands. So I guess this is an example of how it works for me, right? It's not about the lyrics. It's not about the tune, the words, and things like that. It's about the passion and the feeling that the character is experiencing with that. I think that's why, like, I didn't mind it in that sense. Yeah, and I know you're not a fan of the book, Will, and it's fine. You can be wrong or you can be right.
I love the book, and I think what you're saying is right on, though, Nick. As far as that's why he's bringing this up in the book too. Is that was that music and all those things. That was all very character specific, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also the way that story was told because he's telling the story.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, for what it's worth, too, right? Sanderson in the Stormlight Archives uses. He's got a set of characters, species of characters, I guess you could say, right? Where they communicate in rhythms.
Right.
They convey rhythms as an emotion to talk to each other. For sure. To tell others how they're feeling, right? And so that's another interesting thing as well. Not always my favorite thing, though. Like, I love music. I am musically declined. Like, I cannot carry a tune. I can't really play an instrument. Like, you know, like, so for me, it's very challenging for me to take that from a book and put something to it. So for me, I'm like, man, I'm just going to skip over that.
That's fine.
I'm like, I'll graze through it and be like, oh, they think it's awesome. Great. Oh, here's my little bit of information I need to know, right? So that's it.
Well,
thank you so much, Marshall. So I think of the book Kenan Masters and The Peerless Crew by Devon. Yeah. You know, like awesome. Those raps were so good, and I felt like you could feel the flow, and it was integral to the story. You know, now personally, like Lord of the Rings to me is a big snooze fest, the whole thing. And it feels like it's like watching paint dry. And I'm a painter. I don't want to watch it dry. But like with Kenan Masters, it was like there's this energy into it. And I think speaking of Jason Reynolds, there's musicality in his words. And this is what I think I also love so much about LP's writing is because with LP's writing, I feel like you can hear the music and the melody in his stories. And I think Nick brings up a really good point too. When you're tone deaf and you don't really like have an ear for music, that can really like make you blank out. Like you just don't get it. Or maybe sometimes it's like culturally, I don't culturally want to sing the Hobbit songs. Okay. Like I didn't grow up with that beat. So, you know, you don't vibe. Right. But I think because I like hip hop and I grew up with that, like Kenan Masters was like my jam. Or another example, everyone, that you must check out is the Shadow Shaper series by Daniel Jose Older. There's music and rap intermixed in that whole entire book. And it's hilarious because it says a lot about the characters, but it also starts touching upon a little bit seriousness of like what's going on in their world.
No, I love that. I was thinking again about Jason Reynolds too in this, but I kept feeling like I'm like bringing up the same example, but yeah, you don't. And this is one of the things I was talking about with my students, and I on purpose played interviews by him talking about music as an influence to his writing, because just like what you said about LP, even if I was reading there's a graphic novel version of the book too. Even if I was reading that, I feel like I would still hear there is that in the lyrics, in the conversation, in the verse is you can hear the music. It's really cool. It's just, you can tell how influenced he was by, rap and hip hop. But, all right, we got to move forward a little bit. And I think this will help maybe, give them. So next I'm going to do this section as, by itself, because I have a specific question about this. It says, give them unique language, including jargon and tradecraft. So he says, this is one of the pieces of advice that I'll revisit from my last book, but expand upon with new examples and permutations. Every world has its unique jargon, and the better you can capture that language, the more this world will come alive. Your hero lives in a specific world, not a generic one. The people speak and act in ways that combine their cultural history, professional jargon, and unique personalities. You, as a writer, need to combine voices you know from real life with aspects of this world that you've learned about either from your research or lived experience. I'm going to add to this because this is kind of where my question goes, and you guys can respond any way you want to what I'm about to say. The next line he says is, authors who have changed professions always have an advantage. I'm curious because I don't even want to tell you guys how many jobs that I have had. I'm one of those people that have multiple jobs at a time, and I've been working since I was like 11. But the point is like, what professions that you've had or experienced or still doing give you an advantage, and what works really show the author's previous professions showing in their work. So you can take this any way you want. Your profession influencing your writing, what you think about jargon and what I said in the beginning, and of course, authors whose professions come through their writing. The example he uses is like John Grisham, who was a lawyer. What were you going to say, Will? I know. That's why I wasn't going to say it. It is boring. I don't read that stuff, but I hear you. I see your lips moving. I heard what you said.
Go ahead. You can go, Nick. You go first.
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I think I'm going to agree and disagree that the number of job changes adds more to, like, let's say your expertise. I don't agree with that. I mean, you may have more background, if you will, and more experiences, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's always for your benefit in this type of situation. And I'm going to say for myself, I'm a military person. So anytime someone messes something up in TV shows, books, movies, it's a glaring like red eye for me and it ruins it. Mm. But I'm also hypersensitive into my own writing and I overdo it. So it's not, I could see where it's helpful, right? But it's also a double-edged sword. Like it could be to your detriment as well. It's like, you know, you're a jack of all trades where you can kind of do something, but you're not quite an expert at it. And so that's where, like, I would say this is a double-edged sword and double-edged item here that we're kind of talking about. Like, there's pros and cons. You can over-index on it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what I was getting at with that question too, and I hear what you're saying. I think what I was getting at too is like, if, for example, I'm writing a story, I've worked retail. I've also worked in hotels. If I have a character that works in a hotel, I can actually bring something to the table for that character just because I've had that job. You know what I mean? That's kind of all I was implying. But I think the crux of this is really about jargon and giving them a unique language, right? Work jargon and tradecraft was kind of the example, but giving them a unique language as far as characterization goes. So thoughts on that too?
Yeah, I mean, I reflect on my own like military experience on that one. Like, there's slang for everything, right?
Oh yeah.
There's someone who's so good at this too. I mean, Sanderson doesn't use conventional cursing. He makes his own curse words, which I always find hilarious because they don't make any sense. But it's like, all right, like I get it. You're saying the same thing, and it's what we tell our kids. Like, just because you say shoot over again and mother trucker, right, your intent is still the same. There's no difference there, guys. But I mean, I like Scalzi. Scalzi does really good things when it comes to language and jargon and stuff like that for his sci-fi series.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. Will?
Nick, do your kids actually say mother trucker?
Yes. They say every version of every word, and my dumbass over here, because they think it's funny, I'll just go around the house and pretend I'm at them and be like, "What's your bitch ass doing?" And they're like, and they just start laughing, dude. And I'm like, fuck, like I gotta stop that. Like, So I'm the one teaching them all this stuff, but they're smart enough not to actually use the words. And school ruins everything. But yeah, we've had instances of one of my kids yelling, bitch, 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 because he died on a video game. And it was like, it's so funny because they're 10, 11, and 12. It's so funny. But at the same time, you're like, appropriate age limits. Like, once we hit certain ages, I'm not going to care. But yeah.
Yeah. I, as a parent of 2 teenagers that are a little older, at some point, especially when your parents have a potty mouth too, sometimes I'm just like, with Rowan, I'm just like, language, come on. Like, you could have chosen a different word, but I don't really give a shit. But, it is what it is. Will's been waiting to say something about this topic.
Well, and as I was saying...
Ask the West. Oh, God. You know what? Listen, stop interrupting me.
You're getting no sympathy.
You're getting no sympathy points from me for anything. Wait, mention the question again.
This has to do with characterization when it comes to giving them a unique language, including work, jargon, and tradecraft. So, and I added to this thing about the writer's experience having a job and being privy to that jargon or something like that, bringing something to the table as far as characterization for characters you're writing.
So there's 2 points I want to make here. First, I feel like with my job, because I do hair, I meet so many different types of people. And luckily, because my hair skills are very diverse, I can work with any hair texture and have it look amazing. That also widens my market of who I actually touch. I'm sorry, I'm good at my job. But I can
attest to that. I've seen it done. I can attest to it.
So another thing I'd like to say is, like, for slang, like, my friend John used to, like, he like kind of like woke up when I said this, and I was like, oh my God, we totally beat her face. Right. And he thought I was literally beating someone's face. And I said, no, that's the term you use when someone's makeup looks so good. Like, her face was beat, like, we beat it out. So that to me is like
the first time you said that, Will.
Yeah.
I
you
thought
never heard
you were
of it?
accusing me of hitting my wife.
No, we've had this conversation before, and I feel like every time you say it, it's maddening.
I was like, what do you mean? I didn't hit her. And you're like, no, like, her makeup. I was like, who talks like this?
Everyone does around here. So, like, it's normal.
But from New York, we talk about beating each other's face.
But if a character uses that jargon,
Kenyans say your face was beat.
Exactly.
Really?
So, and also Brent explained this on the other episode a while ago. The term beat actually comes from transgendered Black women, because they would, have to cover up some of the abuse that happened to them. And also, like, for me, like, all of my hair and makeup stems from Black women, like me growing up in a Black salon, me working there with my best friend, so, like, there's these things that happen in your career that I feel like are also historically, like, it tells a lot of stories. Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes when people, if you're reading that and you don't write science fiction and fantasy, it can simply mean setting the tone and jargon of, like, your neighborhood, what is culturally. And to me, the one person who does that really well is Elizabeth Acevedo, with The Girl on High and The Poet X. It's all done in verse. It all has very much Latino feel because of the language of Spanish. But what's so great, I feel like everyone should read her anyway. But as a writer, if you're trying to understand, to create a cultural language, you can create a cultural language and still make the character sound individual. I think when you read a lot of people who write science fiction and fantasy at first, they overuse the made-up jargon, and then their characters start to fall flat. I mean, I can even think of some writers that are popular now that I find them to be, like, flat writers. That I don't think they're, like, their characters are boring, the way they speak are boring, and they all sound the same. No shade. I'm not going to mention who I'm thinking of.
Well, let me compliment you, though. You and I have been sharing some short stories back and forth, and sorry, Marshall, to jump in like this. This is actually a skill set I think you are really good at. And in fact, I would say most of us as co-hosts all come from very diverse backgrounds. And I've read everybody's stuff. Like, I think all of us do this really well. I just want to point that out. I want you guys to mull on it, take the compliment.
No, I
think we do this well. And I've noticed, like, I know what Shingai stories are versus Sameem versus Will versus mine versus Marshall's based on these things.
Well, and I think the example that Matt Bird uses in this too is one I was gonna read, and then I was like, I don't want to get into a Star Wars thing. But there's always that thing when Harrison Ford yells at George and says, "Dude, you can write this stuff, but you can't say it." But what he says in the book, he says, "What does it mean to say a ship is Corellian? How is he supposed to react when he's called a nerf herder? What does any of it even mean?" But what I like about this, he does to go on to say, is it was a challenge to four, but it makes the dialogue good. It does say something about the character and the world itself, because he just says Corellian. I think Corellian is mentioned, once, maybe twice in the original trilogy. Nerf herder once. Like, I don't know what a nerf is. I don't know where Corellia is, unless you're a Star Wars geek and later, but it broadens everything and says something about Harrison Ford's character, which is also my favorite character in the series. But anyway, Nick or Will, you got all animated for a second. What you got?
Yeah, just a little side story real quick about this thing. Because
do we have time?
Carrie,
we only got 10 minutes because we're going to run it. Okay.
Carrie talks about this, and it's going to interconnect about characters. So Carrie would always go to George as well and be like, George, I'm saying all this. I just have no idea what it means. So what he did during Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, anytime during these like mouth words of like world building that they had to say, they brought in the visuals. They brought in the visuals so that, they brought in the actual art so they could see. And then what Carrie would do would go up to the script and say, well, I'm going to rewrite it so it sounds better. And this is how Carrie started rewriting scripts, because she made it better.
That's funny. Sorry, we kind of took over there. Shingai, Sameem, you got an opinion on jargon and stuff before we move on? I think we can get one more section in if we cruise.
I think, if we're still talking about like how your day jobs sort of flow into, I think it happens without you realizing sometimes. Like I wrote a time travel romance story a few years back, and one of the reviews mentioned something about targeted ads and data privacy. And I was like, what? And then I realized, like, I went back and read it and was like, yeah, the character is like targeting people. It's basically a company where they'll go back in time and record memories of or happenings of your ancestors. And he's targeting like potential customers to lure them in. And I hadn't thought about that's what he was doing, but it is like data privacy is something I care about, and I work with data. And so it like seeps in whether you like it or not. And then the second thing I'll say is I recently read Alexander Chi's memoir, and he has an essay about working. He mostly worked as a waiter, both at restaurants and as well as for like catering companies in New York. And I haven't read his fiction yet, but he talks about how like the characters you meet and the conversations you hear are like novels in and of themselves. And I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Any thoughts, Shingai?
No, I appreciate what everyone has said. I'm down to move on to the next.
Excellent. All right, we're gonna get one more in. This is my goal. And I grouped these ones again, like I did before. So this next section talks about giving conflicts within the group and giving them oddly complex situations. Okay, so I'm putting these in together, and I think really what I want to, ultimately, I'm asking what your intentionality is behind this when you write. But I like what he says here. So he says, your world will feel more real if your heroes spend more time involved. And I don't know how to say this. Internecine conflicts. I listened on the audiobook and I don't know that word that well. But anyway, internecine conflicts within their group. that conflict with outside groups. In a complex world, the hero is always equally in danger of being stabbed in the back as being stabbed in the front. That's a world we will recognize. And then in the other section where he says oddly complicated situations, he says, the whole goal in this chapter is to get the reader to subconsciously think, no one could make this up. Sometimes this means that you're getting them to subconsciously think no one would make that up. It's a standard piece of writing advice that you should tell simple stories with complex characters, not complex stories with simple characters. But that creates an opportunity for writers because the reader's experiencing simplified plots. You can make your story feel more real by complicating things. So this is asking how you guys feel about when you talk about conflicts in your character within groups and how complex you make situations in order to make the world and the characters more fleshed out. Go ahead, Sameem.
I think this might be something I'm still learning, to be honest. And that I'm challenged by because it takes so much work and effort to build up a world and characters that you like and want to spend time with. And it is a challenge to be like, no, here's a shitty thing that's going to happen to you now. Even if some of them are villains. And so I think it's a process and a learning, and I think something I'm doing more. I think there's part of me that's like, that will question it. I don't know if I heard you that quote right. Was that like,
I'm not sure if I read it right. What quote?
Something about stories having simple plots and complex characters versus complex plots and simple characters.
Yeah. So this is what he says. It's a standard piece of writing advice that you should tell simple stories with complex characters, not complex stories with simple characters. But that creates an opportunity for writers because the reader's expecting simplified plots. You can make your story feel more real by complicating things. I'm not sure if we even agree with this or not, but any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if either is wrong. I think it just depends on what you're trying to share as the writer, what you want your reader to go through.
I like that. Someone else? Go for it.
Yeah, I think with the complex characters bit, I do agree with that because I think one of the struggles that I've had with a lot of older storytelling is the very binary good versus bad, hero versus villain. And actually that's one of the things that I struggle with in this book, like the consistent use of hero as the protagonist, where I'm just like, that's not necessarily, your protagonist isn't necessarily a hero. And that also feels very hero's journey, which is its own thing. But yeah, I do like complex characters. And I think that one of the cheat codes that I use in my own writing is starting with a conflict in the beginning of the story sometimes. That way I spend like a good chunk of the rest of the story trying to resolve the conflict that's already like really intense from the very beginning. Yeah, those are my immediate thoughts.
Well,
I mean, I think what I got from the book too is like, make your plot simple so it's believable. And I think, would any of us believe that we would have a criminal and a psycho as a president? I mean, yes, to a degree, yes, we would, okay, knowing our history, for sure. But I think sometimes it feels so like you can't make this up, that anything now that I read is believable to me. Because we are living in the upside down.
Oh man, every headline is chaos, and it's like, okay, sorry.
That's how, like I'm interrupting too, so sorry. But watching like House of Cards when the American version first came out, it was like after a few seasons, like this felt too unbelievable. But then it felt too lame compared to what was actually going on by like 2015. And so, yeah, I don't think that there is a convincing story necessarily given the baseline.
I just watched a video essay titled "Don't Believe Him." It's really interesting. You should watch it. And it's just like all the ways that having this president is showing us like a bunch of different lies and like that's his trick. He's trying to get us to believe him, even though there's so much that he doesn't actually have the power to do. Not there.
So we didn't get as far as I would have liked. We almost finished with this section. The next section is universal behavior. The things we didn't get to this time had to do with just little things, and we almost got there. But I think the behavior conversation is really going to take a minute. So I want to get everybody to kind of either read it ahead of time or think about like the kind of universal things that make characters believable. And I want to, and part of that conversation in my head, at least, is talking about some visual storytelling, TV shows and movies and TV shows, where, I mean, obviously if we're watching actors, we shouldn't believe it, but why are we so invested? Why, especially when it comes to sci-fi and fantasy and that kind of thing. So that's kind of I'm going to leave us kind of with that thought. And we'll easily wrap up this section in like 5 minutes and then jump into that when we come back. But I'm stoked because I think what we talked about here tonight will be really good for the Discord in the meantime. And when we come back to this book, hopefully we'll have a lot of conversations to pull from, especially even from that. We would love to bring some of our listeners just to bookend the show, listeners input a little bit. So definitely jump in the Discord and we can bring something up if it's something that resonates with us for sure. But then also feel free to support us because, money's good, and show us that you love us. No, but really though, we do appreciate every patron we have. And we hopefully didn't miss anybody. And if we did, please let us know and tell your friends.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.